I never imagined that a simple night shift at the old medical center would forever scar my soul, but here I am, compelled to share my truth. It all began on a chilly November evening when I, a relatively new nurse at St. Helena's Hospital, was assigned to the notorious night shift in the psychiatric wing. The corridors, dimly lit and whispering secrets of past lives, instantly filled me with a foreboding sense that I was venturing into unknown, haunted territory. That first night was unsettling. As I walked the sterile halls, I couldn't shake the feeling that unseen eyes were following my every step. I chalked it up to my imagination, fueled by countless urban legends about restless spirits wandering the halls. Yet when I passed by room 217, I distinctly heard a soft sobbing that sent shivers down my spine. I paused, heart pounding, and strained my ears. The sound was unmistakably human, yet there was no patient assigned to that room. Gathering my courage, I knocked gently, only to be met with silence and an eerie coldness that seeped through the door. I later learned that room 217 had a tragic history. A patient who had taken her own life under mysterious circumstances decades ago. As the hours wore on, the atmosphere grew increasingly oppressive. I noticed how the fluorescent lights flickered intermittently, casting fleeting shadows that danced along the walls. At one point, while checking the vital signs of a particularly disturbed patient, I caught a glimpse of a pale figure in the reflection of the window. I spun around, but there was no one there, only the empty hallway stretching into darkness. My pulse raced, and I couldn't help but wonder if I had been visited by a ghost. During my break, I sought solace in the staff lounge, where my colleague Maria shared a similar experience from her night shift a few weeks earlier. She described an encounter with an inexplicable presence that whispered her name and made her skin crawl. As we spoke, the air seemed to thicken with dread, and the silence was punctuated only by the distant hum of the hospital's machinery. It was then that I realized I was not alone in my terror. Something malevolent was lurking here, feeding off the fears of those who dared to work these long, solitary nights. The horror escalated on my third night. I was alone in the wing, covering for a colleague who had called in sick, when I heard a persistent knocking at the door of an unused storage room. At first, I dismissed it as a malfunctioning intercom, but the knocking grew louder and more insistent, echoing through the empty halls. I approached the door cautiously, my hand trembling as I reached for the knob. Before I could even turn it, the door creaked open on its own, revealing a dark room that exuded a foul, musty odor. In the beam of my flashlight, I thought I saw the outline of a figure, its eyes glistening with an unnatural light. I stumbled back in horror, my heart thundering as I fled down the corridor, convinced that I had witnessed something unworldly. That night, the hospital seemed to become a labyrinth of terror. Every door and corner held the promise of another inexplicable phenomenon. I found myself constantly looking over my shoulder, expecting to see that ghostly figure or hear those heart-stopping knocks. The experience left me shaken, and I began to question my own sanity. Had I imagined the events, or was there really a sinister presence at work? I spent countless sleepless hours researching the hospital's history, uncovering stories of mistreatment, neglect, and unexplained deaths. It became clear that the building was steeped in tragedy, and the spirits of those who had suffered seemed to be trapped in a cycle of despair and anger. In a moment of desperation, I confided in Dr. Stevens, a seasoned physician known for his pragmatic approach to the supernatural. He listened intently as I recounted every detail of my experiences, his face growing increasingly grave. "There's a dark history to this place," he said softly. "Some nights, the veil between our world and the other becomes dangerously thin. His words provided a modicum of comfort, yet they also confirmed my worst fears, that the horrors I had witnessed were not figments of my imagination, but the restless remnants of souls in torment. One particularly harrowing night, I found myself alone again, tasked with a routine round in the wing. As I passed by an old supply closet, a whisper reached my ears, a husky, sorrowful murmur that called my name. The voice was so distinct, so personal, that it felt as though it were speaking directly to me. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the door, and then, with a sudden rush of inexplicable courage, I opened it. Inside, the room was shrouded in darkness, but as I stepped forward, a chill enveloped me. I saw fleeting images of a young woman, her eyes full of despair, reaching out for help. I felt her anguish, her longing to be free from the shackles of her tragic past. It was a moment that transcended the boundaries of life and death, a connection forged in the silent agony of the forgotten. Every subsequent night became a test of my resolve. I was plagued by nightmares that replayed the horrors of the shift, my mind haunted by spectral figures and echoes of the past. My colleagues, too, began to share their own unsettling encounters. The once mundane night shift had become a collective experience of terror, a shared burden that left us questioning the nature of reality itself. We spoke in hushed tones about the inexplicable occurrences, our conversations a mix of fear and disbelief. Each story, though different in detail, echoed the same chilling refrain, a place where the boundaries between life and death had dissolved, leaving behind only sorrow and malevolence. Now, years later, I still bear the scars of those long nights. The experience has left an indelible mark on my soul, a constant reminder of the fragile line that separates our world from the next. I continue to work in a medical field, though I avoid the night shift whenever possible, haunted by memories of ghostly whispers and flickering lights. The hospital, with all its sterile corridors and hushed secrets, remains a place of healing for many. Yet for me, it will always be a nexus of terror and sorrow. I share this story not for sympathy, but as a warning to those who might one day find themselves alone in a place where the dead refuse to rest. The night holds secrets that are better left undisturbed, and sometimes the echoes of the past are far more dangerous than we can ever imagine. I am forever changed by those nights, a living testament to the fact that even in our modern world, the supernatural can reach out from the shadows and remind us of a time when darkness reigned supreme. Our chilling tale concludes here. Ready for the next ghostly whisper? I never expected that my life would be forever altered by a single night shift at the old Winslow mansion. I worked as the overnight caretaker, responsible for securing the premises and maintaining the aged corridors of what had once been a grand estate, now transformed into a small museum. The building, with its faded portraits and creaking wooden floors, held an undeniable air of melancholy, as though the echoes of lost lives still lingered in every corner. I had heard the rumors, whispers of tragic pasts and unexplained occurrences, but nothing could have prepared me for the night that would shatter my sense of reality. It began on a damp autumn evening when I arrived at the mansion for my shift. The wind howled outside, and a chill seemed to seep through the thick stone walls as I unlocked the heavy front door. I made my way through the dimly lit corridors, my flashlight slicing through the oppressive darkness. The museum was quiet, the only sounds being my own footsteps and the distant drip of water echoing in the vast halls. As I passed the grand ballroom, I couldn't help but pause. The ornate ceiling above seemed to whisper tales of opulence and sorrow, its intricate designs now obscured by the passage of time. I settled into my small office near the main staircase and began my routine rounds. It was during these solitary patrols that I first noticed the inexplicable. While checking the old storage room near the east wing, I heard a soft, almost mournful humming. I froze in the doorway, straining to make out the source of the sound. The tune was delicate and sorrowful, as if someone were singing a lullaby meant to soothe a broken heart. I stepped inside, and for a brief moment, I saw a shadow flit across the far wall. My heart pounded as I called out, but no answer came. I left the room shaken, the humming fading into the silence behind me. Later that night, as I walked past a long-forgotten gallery filled with portraits of the mansion's past inhabitants, I caught sight of a woman standing near one of the larger paintings. She was dressed in an elegant gown from a bygone era, her features indistinct yet hauntingly beautiful. I blinked, certain that my tired mind was playing tricks on me, but when I looked again, she had vanished. I tried to convince myself that it was a trick of the light, a remnant of my own weariness, but deep down, I felt that the mansion was trying to tell me something. Determined to carry out my duties, I continued my rounds, though the building now seemed to pulse with an otherworldly energy. I reached the upper floors, where the old guest rooms lay in eerie disarray. As I passed room 12, a sudden cold draft brushed past me, and the door creaked open on its own. Reluctantly, I stepped inside. The room was empty except for a solitary rocking chair that moved gently back and forth, as if pushed by an unseen hand. The rhythmic creak of the chair mingled with the sound of my racing heartbeat, and I felt an overwhelming sense of sorrow and longing emanating from the space. It was in that moment I recalled the tragic tale of Eleanor Winslow, the mansion's original mistress. According to local lore, Eleanor had been betrayed and murdered by a man she had trusted, her spirit doomed to wander the halls of her once beloved home. That very night, as I stood frozen in the guest room, I distinctly heard a whisper, a fragile, broken plea for justice. I couldn't understand the words, but the pain in the tone was unmistakable. I left the room with a heavy heart, feeling as if I had brushed against the veil that separates the living from the dead. As midnight approached, the mansion's atmosphere grew more oppressive. Shadows seemed to merge with the darkness, and the air was thick with the scent of old roses and decay. In the corridor near the library, I was startled by a sudden clatter of books falling off the shelves. I rushed to the scene, only to find nothing out of place. However, in the reflection of a polished antique mirror, I saw a glimpse of a gaunt figure in Victorian attire. I spun around, but the corridor was empty, save for the lingering echo of my own footsteps. Desperate to make sense of these unsettling events, I sought out the museum's caretaker records the following morning. I discovered that many of the incidents I experienced had been reported by previous night staff, yet none had ever dared to speak of them openly. The common thread among all the stories was Eleanor Winslow's sorrowful presence, a presence that seemed to grow stronger during the late hours of the night. That discovery did little to ease my mounting terror. Instead, it solidified my belief that I was being drawn into a web of supernatural despair. The climax of my ordeal occurred on my final night before transferring to a day shift. The mansion felt unusually restless, as if the very walls were alive with whispered secrets. I was making my usual rounds through the grand foyer when I heard the distinct sound of a piano playing, a haunting melody that resonated with deep sorrow. The music led me to the music room, a place long abandoned and covered in dust. There, in the dim light of my flashlight, I saw Eleanor. She stood by an antique piano, her eyes filled with despair, her fingers hovering above the keys in a gesture of eternal lament. In that moment, time seemed to stand still. I was overwhelmed by an indescribable mix of pity and terror. Eleanor's expression was one of profound anguish, as though she had been carrying the weight of her tragic fate for centuries. I reached out instinctively, but as soon as my hand moved, she began to fade away, her form dissolving into the shadows. The music stopped abruptly, leaving only an echo of its sorrow behind. I stood there, paralyzed, feeling as if I'd been granted a fleeting glimpse into a realm where agony and beauty intertwined. The encounter left me shaken to my core. I returned to my office, unable to shake the feeling that the mansion had changed me irrevocably. The following day, I tendered my resignation, unable to bear the thought of spending another night amidst those restless spirits. I left Winslow Mansion with a heavy heart, the memory of that ghostly encounter forever etched into my soul. Even now, years later, I find myself haunted by those nights. I lie awake in the darkness, the distant sound of a piano or the faint whisper of a long-forgotten plea echoing in my mind. I have tried to move on, to forget the terror that seeped into my every waking moment. But the mansion and the sorrowful spirit of Eleanor Winslow continues to linger in my memories. I share my story as both a catharsis and a warning. There are places where the past refuses to fade, where the boundaries between life and death blur, and where the ghosts of yesteryear still hold sway over the present. Our chilling tale concludes here. Ready for the next ghostly whisper? I never imagined that a night shift could change my life forever. I was a security guard at the old Grand Central Depot, a once thriving train station, now turned museum and storage facility for vintage locomotives. The building, with its cavernous halls and abandoned platforms, was a relic of a bygone era. I'd heard the whispers about inexplicable events that plagued the depot after midnight, but I never expected to become a part of its haunted legacy. My first night on duty was a routine one, or so I believed. I arrived just before dusk, the last rays of sunlight dancing on the glass ceiling of the main hall. The echo of my footsteps filled the expansive space as I checked the security monitors and prepared for what was supposed to be a quiet night. However, as the clock struck midnight, the silence was shattered by a series of unsettling sounds, a rhythmic tapping that seemed to come from the darkened corridors leading to the old waiting room. I grabbed my flashlight and headed toward the source. The tapping grew louder with every step. As I turned the corner, I saw a shadow move across the wall, too deliberate to be just an animal. The beam of my light revealed nothing but a cold, empty corridor. Yet, the tapping persisted, echoing off the brick walls like a Morse code message I couldn't decipher. I pressed on, feeling a mixture of dread and curiosity, convinced that something was wrong in the depot. I reached the waiting room, a vast space lined with dilapidated benches and dusty old timetables hanging on the wall. The air was thick with the scent of stale tobacco and rust, a remnant of a long-forgotten past. In the center of the room, I noticed a solitary suitcase, its leather worn and stained with time. As I approached, the tapping stopped abruptly. The sudden silence was more disturbing than the noise had been. I knelt down and inspected the suitcase, half expecting to find a hidden recording device or some trick of the mind. Instead, I found nothing, just an old, cracked leather case that belonged to someone who had traveled many years ago. Shaken but determined to get back to my post, I made my way back to the security office. On the monitors, I noticed something bizarre. The image of a man in a tattered conductor's uniform appeared fleetingly on one of the cameras. The figure, pale and translucent, seemed to drift through the station with a sense of purpose. I couldn't tell if he was heading toward the platform or disappearing into the walls, but his eyes, if you could call them that, held a sadness that chilled me to the bone. Throughout the night, I struggled to shake the feeling that I was being watched. The depot's corridors took on a life of their own. I heard soft murmurs and distant footsteps even when no one else was around. At one point, while patrolling the long-forgotten platform, I encountered a gust of icy wind that swept past me like a whisper from another world. In that fleeting moment, I thought I saw the silhouette of a woman standing at the far end of the platform, her features obscured by shadows. When I called out to her, no answer came. Only the echo of my own voice, swallowed by the vast emptiness of the depot. The next few nights became an agonizing ordeal. Each shift brought with it new, inexplicable events that gnawed at my sanity. On one particularly long night, I was assigned to monitor the old baggage room, a cluttered space filled with abandoned luggage and forgotten belongings. As I was rifling through a stack of old suitcases for something that might explain the strange occurrences, I heard a whisper. At first, it was barely audible, a soft voice saying, "Help me, I froze." The sound seemed to come from behind me, yet when I turned, there was no one there. The words repeated, each time growing more desperate. I felt a cold hand brush against my arm, sending a surge of terror through my body. I bolted from the room, my heart pounding in my ears as I sprinted down the hallways, convinced that I had disturbed a spirit in need. Desperate for answers, I began poring over old records in the depot's dusty archives during my rare moments of downtime. I uncovered the tragic history of the station, a tale of loss and betrayal. Decades ago, during a bitter winter, a young conductor named Samuel had vanished without a trace. Rumors swirled that he had been the victim of foul play, his life snuffed out by a jealous rival. Locals spoke of his restless spirit, doomed to wander the depot, forever seeking justice. I couldn't help but wonder if the spectral conductor I had seen on the monitors was Samuel, reaching out from beyond the grave. One fateful night, my resolve was put to the ultimate test. The depot was unusually silent, the oppressive weight of unseen eyes making every moment feel like an eternity. I was patrolling the service tunnel, a narrow passage behind the main hall, when I heard a distinct sound of rustling fabric. The sound led me to a sealed door that I'd never noticed before. The door, adorned with intricate carvings and faded gold leaf, beckoned me closer. I hesitated, recalling every ghost story I'd heard about the depot, but the need to uncover the truth overpowered my fear. With trembling hands, I opened the door and stepped into a small, hidden chamber. Inside, the room was illuminated by a single, flickering candle, its flame dancing as if in tune with an unseen heartbeat. On a dusty table lay a worn journal. I flipped it open and discovered that it belonged to a young woman named Clara, a former station employee who had mysteriously disappeared years earlier. In her entries, she described encounters with a benevolent spirit who had tried to protect her from harm, a spirit that now seemed to linger within these walls. As I read her final entry, the candle flame sputtered violently and the temperature in the room plummeted. Suddenly, I felt a presence behind me, a figure emerging from the shadows. It was Clara herself, her eyes filled with a sorrow so profound that I felt my soul shudder. "You must help him," she whispered urgently, her voice trembling with both fear and hope. Before I could ask who she meant, the chamber plunged into darkness as the candle blew out. I fumbled for my flashlight, and when the beam cut through the black, Clara was gone, leaving behind only the echo of her desperate plea. I returned to the main hall in a daze, my mind racing with the implications of what I'd witnessed. The spectral figures, the whispered voices, the unexplained occurrences, all of it pointed to a tragic narrative woven into the fabric of the depot. It was as if the spirits were trying to communicate, to warn me of something yet to come. In the following nights, the apparitions grew bolder. I saw the ghost of the conductor, his eyes locked on mine, as if pleading for resolution, and the fleeting image of Clara drifting down the hall, urging me onward. The nights eventually took their toll on my health and sanity. Sleep eluded me, replaced by relentless nightmares of shadowy figures and cold, dead hands reaching out from the darkness. I knew that I was caught in a cycle of haunting that had no clear end. The depot had become a prison of memories and regrets, a place where the living and the dead were inextricably linked. Every night, I could feel their sorrow and their anger, their longing to be heard, to find closure. I eventually decided that I could no longer bear the weight of the night shifts at Grand Central Depot. With a heavy heart, I resigned from my post, leaving behind the haunted corridors and the whispers of a forgotten past. Even now, as I sit in the daylight, the memories of those ghostly encounters linger like a shadow at the edge of my vision. I share my story not only as a testament to what I endured, but also as a cautionary tale to anyone who might find themselves alone in a place where the dead refuse to rest. Our chilling tale concludes here. Ready for the next ghostly whisper? I never imagined that my life would take such a harrowing turn on that fateful night. I was assigned the graveyard shift at the old county hospital, a place whispered about among co-workers for its strange occurrences. It was a cool autumn evening, and the air seemed to carry an unspoken dread as I stepped into the dimly lit corridors. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched from the shadows as I made my rounds through empty halls. At first, the silence of a night shift was a welcome relief from the chaos of the day. However, as the hours crept by, my unease grew with each passing minute. I would catch glimpses of movement in the corners of my eyes, only to find nothing when I turned around. A cold wind would brush against my neck, as if unseen fingers were trying to pull me into the darkness. I remember thinking, this must be my mind playing tricks on me, but deep down, I sensed that something was terribly wrong. I recall speaking with a fellow night guard over the radio early in my shift. "You hear that noise?" I whispered, my voice trembling slightly. There was a long, eerie silence before a distorted reply crackled through the static. "Hear what?" "Just the wind, I reckon." His dismissive tone did little to calm my nerves. I could tell he was trying to cover his own fears with humor, but his voice betrayed an underlying anxiety that mirrored my own. As the hours moved slowly, the isolation became suffocating. I patrolled the abandoned wings of the hospital, where patients had long been relocated or forgotten by time. In these corridors, the air grew thick and shadows contorted into monstrous forms. I stepped into a room once used for quarantine and was immediately overcome by an inexplicable chill. In the corner, I thought I saw the shape of a figure huddled in a corner. I froze, heart pounding in my ears. When I blinked, the figure disappeared, leaving only the oppressive silence as company. I began to document my experiences in a small notebook, an attempt to rationalize the irrational fears clawing at my sanity. The entries were frantic, scribbled in haste, as if the mere act of writing could somehow exorcise the malevolent presence that haunted the halls. "I am not alone," I wrote, "and these walls whisper the secrets of the lost." Each sentence felt like a desperate prayer, a cry for help that the empty building would never answer. Then came the incident that shattered any remnants of normalcy. On a night like any other, I was checking the storage room when a sudden loud thud echoed through the building. It was not the sound of a falling object, but a deliberate, heavy knock that sent shivers down my spine. I moved closer, flashlight in hand, every step a battle against my mounting terror. The beam of light danced over old medical equipment and dusty crates until it landed on a large, old mirror leaning against the wall. I approached the mirror slowly, my breath coming in short, ragged gasps. In the reflection behind me, I saw a figure, a pale, indistinct shape that hovered near the doorway. I spun around, only to be met with empty air and the sound of my own frantic breathing. The reflection, however, remained in the mirror, watching me with eyes I could almost feel. "Who are you?" I found myself whispering into the void, the words barely audible in the oppressive gloom. In that heart-stopping moment, time seemed to freeze. The silence was shattered by a dissonant whisper that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "You shouldn't be here," it intoned, a voice laden with sorrow and malice. I stood motionless, rooted to the spot, as the temperature plummeted and my senses screamed in protest. I couldn't tear my eyes away from the mirror, compelled by a horrifying blend of fear and morbid curiosity. Desperate to escape the nightmare unfolding before me, I stumbled back toward the exit. But the hallways seemed to stretch into infinity, twisting and turning in an impossible labyrinth. It was as if the hospital itself had come alive, its walls pulsing with an otherworldly energy. The once familiar corridors now felt alien, each step echoing with the sound of my heart's frantic beat. I could no longer trust my senses, for every shadow, every flicker of light, seemed to be hiding malevolent intent. At one point, I encountered another spirit, a disembodied voice that begged me to remember the tragedies that had taken place within these walls. "Do not forget us. We were lost in pain," it murmured softly. The sorrow in its tone was overwhelming, and for a fleeting moment, I felt as though I was witnessing a tragic history, one of despair and abandonment. It was a reminder that the hospital was not just a building, but a living testament to the suffering of those who had once walked its halls. Throughout that long, agonizing night, I experienced flashes of visions that defied explanation. Faces filled with anguish materialized and vanished before my eyes, their hollow eyes pleading silently for salvation. I witnessed fragments of long-forgotten events, a doctor desperately trying to save a dying patient, a nurse weeping over an unspoken loss. In each vision, the torment was palpable, as if the very fabric of life had been torn asunder by grief and regret. By the early hours of dawn, my resistance crumbled beneath the relentless barrage of terror. I collapsed into a chair in a darkened lounge, the events of the night replaying in an endless loop in my mind. "I can't do this anymore," I whispered to myself, tears streaming down my face. The experiences of that night had invaded my thoughts, haunting me with vivid nightmares that would persist long after the shift ended. Now, even months later, I am tormented by memories of that night. Sometimes, when the clock strikes midnight, I find myself reliving the horrors. The echoing footsteps in empty corridors, the spectral figures that moved with unnatural grace, and the incessant whisper of the lost souls. I have tried to confide in my colleagues, to find solace in the shared understanding of our nightly ordeals, but the terror is mine to bear. The hospital's dark legacy continues to plague me, a relentless specter lurking just beyond the veil of sanity. Throughout these recollections, one immutable truth remains. I stand before you not merely as a survivor of that fateful shift, but as a witness to the forces that dwell in darkness. I share every trembling moment of that night, so that you, too, may understand the peril that lies hidden behind the mundane. In every creak of the floorboards and every unexpected gust of wind, there exists a fragment of the agony that once echoed through those haunted halls. In the quiet after the storm, I remain haunted, forever bound to that night. eternally lost. Our chilling tale concludes here. Ready for the next ghostly whisper? I still remember that bitterly cold night when I started my new job as the night custodian at the old rail depot. The decrepit building, once a thriving station filled with the hustle and bustle of passengers, had been shut down for decades. When they decided to refurbish it into a modern art gallery, they hired me to keep watch during the vulnerable hours of the night. Little did I know that my shift would soon dissolve into a surreal nightmare. The first hour passed quietly as I made my way through long, echoing corridors and empty waiting rooms. I felt a persistent chill that seemed to seep not just through the decaying bricks, but inside my very bones. The silence was profound, broken only by the creak of aging pipes and the occasional drip of water that fell like Morse code in the dark. I reassured myself that it was merely the chill of an old building settling for the night. Yet, as midnight approached, an eerie sensation gradually took hold. I began to sense the presence of someone or something moving in the periphery of my vision. The grand clock above the main hall struck midnight with a sonorous tone that reverberated through the cavernous space. At that instant, the overhead lights flickered, casting peculiar, jagged shadows along the corridors. I chalked it up to faulty wiring, but a gnawing apprehension persisted. I proceeded to inspect the old waiting room. The faded benches and dusty pamphlets seemed like relics of another era. But tonight they exuded an inexplicable aura of sorrow. While cleaning near an ancient ticket booth, I noticed what looked like a faint imprint of a handprint on the glass. It was as though someone had pressed their hand against it from the other side, softer than any earthly touch, yet chilling in its intensity. I felt an inexplicable pull to reach out and touch the glass, but my rational mind warned me against it. Strange occurrences began to escalate with a speed that robbed me of composure. Walking down the platform, I heard a sound akin to whispers, too low to be distinct words, but laden with despair. "I'm waiting. Help." They seemed to murmur in sync with the echoes. My heart hammered in my chest as I followed the intangible sound toward a disused waiting area. There, in a dim alcove, I perceived the spectral figure of a young woman dressed in old-fashioned attire. Her eyes, though empty, shimmered with a sorrowful longing. I couldn't tell if she was a figment of my exhausted mind, but she beckoned silently, her lips parting in a quiet plea. I tried to speak, but my voice was strangled with fear. The apparition dissolved like smoke before I could catch her features properly. In the silence that followed, the temperature dropped so abruptly that I could see my breath. Each exhalation a ghostly wisp in the darkness. I was desperate to restore normalcy, so I retreated to the security office where cameras overlooked various parts of the station. With trembling hands, I scrutinized the screens, hoping to find a rational explanation for the events. To my growing horror, one monitor showed a corridor that I distinctly remembered as empty. Yet there, drifting slowly down the hallway, was the faint silhouette of someone, dressed in attire from the early 1900s. The image was grainy and blurred, but the figure's deliberate, slow pace was unmistakable. I toggled the camera angle several times, but the figure continued its spectral journey, disappearing near a locked maintenance door that had been sealed for safety reasons. My rational mind, despite the mounting terror, tried to dismiss the anomalies as tricks of light or faulty electronics. However, as the night stretched on, more bizarre happenings unfolded. The once orderly station now resembled a stage set for a long-forgotten tragedy. Footsteps echoed in the distance, not belonging to any living soul, and the soft cadence of a piano melody, mournful and haunting, floated through the corridors. In a forgotten corner of the main hall, I discovered an antique gramophone that inexplicably began to play on its own. The melancholic tune evoked images of lovers bidding farewell, and as the notes drifted into silence, I felt the overwhelming sense that I was not alone. Then, I encountered a startling experience that shattered my remaining composure. While passing by the old waiting room one last time, I noticed a set of rusted keys clattered onto the floor as if thrown by an unseen hand. On the wall adjacent to where they lay, a message appeared, scrawled in what looked like faded red paint. "Forgive US." The graffiti was strangely reminiscent of a confession, or perhaps a plea for absolution. I knelt beside the keys, wondering if this was left behind by someone from the past, a person desperate to atone for hidden sins, but I felt no comfort in the gesture. Instead, it was as though the building itself was crying out in anguish. As the clock inched closer to dawn, an oppressive gloom swallowed the station. I retraced my steps, feeling the labyrinthine corridors twist into unfamiliar configurations. At one point, I was certain that the path I had taken was now altered. The route to the exit seemed to have transformed into an endless maze. Panic clawed at my throat, urging me to hurry, to escape the building that pulsed with the restless energy of its spectral inhabitants. In the final, desperate moments before dawn, I reached a narrow passage that led to a forgotten platform. It was there that I faced the station's ultimate mystery. A train, ancient and shrouded in mist, slowly chugged into view. Its windows glowed with an unearthly light, and the faint sound of its whistle was both inviting and terrifying. The train halted as though waiting for me to board. Driven by a mix of dread and resignation, I stepped forward. The very moment my foot crossed the threshold, the air around me seemed to vibrate with the weight of unspoken memories. Inside, the carriage was filled with silent passengers, apparitions draped in sepia tones, locked forever in a time that had long passed. Their eyes, hollow yet full of stories, bore into me as if demanding to share their tragic past. In that eerie confinement, I realized that the train was not a vehicle of escape, but a vessel of remembrance, collecting souls whose lives had been abruptly cut short by the relentless march of time. I could feel the intensity of their sorrow, the endless ache of memories too deep to forget. As the spectral locomotive rumbled silently in motion, I found myself straddling the boundary between the living and the dead. Every fiber of my being screamed to turn back, but I was compelled onward, as if the station and its ghostly remnants had claimed me as one of their own. With the first rays of dawn stretching through the grimy windows, the train began to dissolve like mist under the sun's scrutiny. One by one, the ethereal passengers vanished, leaving behind nothing but echoes of their lost voices. I stumbled off the platform onto the cold, dew-soaked ground, my soul trembling with the aftermath of that surreal ride. I had endured a night that defied all logic and reason, a night that bound my fate to the tormented relics of the past. Even as the pale light of dawn crept in, I could still sense the weight of countless whispered confessions and mournful farewells lingering in the air, reminding me that some nights never truly end. Our chilling tale concludes here. Ready for the next ghostly whisper? I remember the night I took on a new job at the historic Bellamy Estate, a mansion-turned-museum that had once hosted extravagant parties and theatrical performances. As the newly hired night security officer, I was told that my duty was to simply patrol the corridors and ensure nothing untoward occurred. Yet, as soon as I stepped through the ornate front doors under the cold glow of a full moon, I sensed that I was stepping into a realm far removed from the ordinary. The museum's grand foyer, with its sweeping staircase and faded portraits, told stories of a bygone era. I spent the first part of my shift in what appeared to be a quiet and desolate environment. However, the silence was soon interrupted by subtle sounds. A soft piano note here, a barely audible whisper there. At first, I dismissed these as the creaks and sighs of an old building settling into the night, but a nagging sensation began to take root deep within me. It wasn't long before I embarked on my routine rounds down the endless corridors lined with antique paintings and relics. The deeper I went into the museum, the heavier the air became, as if the atmosphere itself was saturated with memories and regrets. One corridor in particular caught my attention, a narrow passage behind the exhibit of Victorian costumes. The dim light of my flashlight revealed a wall studded with faded photographs. I paused before a photograph of a woman in an elegant, sorrowful pose, and in that moment, I felt her eyes watching me with an intensity that defied explanation. I continued on, trying to shake off the growing unease. In a gallery of old stage props, I suddenly heard the gentle tap of footsteps echoing off the marble floor. I stopped in my tracks and listened, a deliberate and measured tap, distinct and purposeful, as if someone was pacing back and forth. I turned quickly, but the room was empty, save for broken trunks and dusty props. No explanation could satisfy the sensation that I was not alone. While checking the antique storeroom, I discovered an old projector left behind from the museum's theater days. Curiosity got the better of my initial trepidation, and I set it up in a small and used screening room. As I fumbled with the controls, the projector whirred to life on its own, casting flickering images onto a blank wall. These weren't just random flashes. I saw scenes of the ballroom in its prime, elegant dancers swirling in a meticulously choreographed waltz, but their faces were veiled in a sorrow that hinted at unfinished stories. The air turned cold, and a palpable sadness filled the room. I shivered, realizing that I had inadvertently tapped into echoes of the past that refused to be forgotten. The most bizarre occurrence came later as I ascended the grand staircase to the museum's upper gallery, a part of the building that was seldom used. As I reached the top, the temperature plummeted and a translucent figure manifested at the far end of the corridor. It was a man in a tailored suit, his expression one of longing and quiet despair. He seemed to float rather than walk, drifting slowly toward me with eyes that pleaded for recognition. I called out, "Hello," but his silence was overwhelming. Before I could process the encounter, he vanished, leaving only a lingering scent of old tobacco and regret in the still air. My pulse raced as I hurried to the security office to report what I had seen over the crackling radio. The response was skeptical, a terse acknowledgement accompanied by a reminder that I was alone with my thoughts in an old building known for its eccentricities. The rational part of my mind argued that my imagination must be playing tricks on me after a long, lonely night. Yet, every sense in my body screamed otherwise, fueling a terror that was as real as the antique relics surrounding me. I resolved to complete my rounds and leave soon. But fate had other plans. In the east wing of the museum, in a room that once served as a costume dressing area, I found another inexplicable clue. On an antique vanity mirror, faint handprints traced along the glass with an eerie precision, as if a delicate child's hand had recently pressed against it. These fingerprints appeared almost luminous in the moonlight that filtered through a broken window. I traced my fingers along the glass, feeling an otherworldly chill that spread like a ghostly whisper across my skin. The moment my hand made contact, I heard a soft, pleading voice that seemed to echo, "Don't leave me behind." The sound was both heartbreaking and terrifying, plunging me into a state of vulnerable despair. The hours dragged on, each one more unsettling than the last. I discovered more oddities, doors that creaked open without any sign of a breeze, objects that seemed to move in the periphery of my vision, and the constant, unnerving sensation of being shadowed by presences unseen. Every time I tried to muster the courage to investigate further, an inexplicable force compelled me to retreat, as though the estate itself was warning me to keep my distance. At one point, while navigating the labyrinthine corridors, I found myself inexplicably drawn to the museum's closed-off auditorium, a place where voices from another time seemed to linger in the dark. I cautiously approached the heavy, velvet-draped stage and, out of habit, took a seat among the rows of empty chairs. As I sat, the room came alive with quiet murmurs and soft footsteps that filled the space with spectral life. Ghostly figures began to materialize before me, each one a remnant of the grand performances once held there. Their transparent forms moved with the grace of seasoned actors, enacting scenes that no longer belonged to the living. The spectacle was breathtaking and horrifying, a silent reenactment of passion, loss, and the relentless passage of time. In that moment, I realized that my presence had not gone unnoticed by these tortured souls. They were not hostile, but desperate to communicate the tragedy of their existence. Among them, I saw a young man with eyes full of anguish, clutching a weathered letter as if it held the key to his salvation. I could almost feel the pain of a life cut tragically short, and in that fleeting instant, I resolved to help them find peace. Yet, as quickly as the apparition appeared, it faded into the dim gloom of the auditorium, leaving me with more questions than answers. The climax of my night came unexpectedly. While making my final rounds near the museum's secluded garden, I encountered an unsettling tableau. In the center of a neglected fountain stood a figure cloaked in shadow, a woman whose eyes bore the weight of unspeakable sorrow. She reached out toward the fountain's water, and as I drew near, the liquid surface shimmered and rippled with scenes of the past, moments of joy, heartbreak, and the silent agony of souls condemned to eternal remembrance. I saw glimpses of her life, a love lost to time, secrets that festered in the darkness, and a final goodbye that echoed endlessly among the stones. Before I could reach out to her, the vision shattered like fragile glass, leaving me drenched in cold sweat and a profound sense of melancholy. By the time the first light of dawn crept in through the tall, arched windows, I was exhausted, mentally and physically drained from the relentless barrage of supernatural encounters. I submitted my report to my skeptical supervisor, recounting every detail as if transcribing a fever dream. Deep in my soul, I knew that what I had experienced was something far beyond mere figments of an overactive imagination. Even now, as daylight battles the remnants of the night's terrors, I struggle to reconcile the rational with the inexplicable. The Bellamy estate remains a haven for restless spirits, an eternal monument to lives lived and lost. Every night, I remember that I walked among the forgotten, and each day, the haunting echoes of their sorrow linger in my thoughts. I share my experience not to scare, but to remind all who dare to tread in the shadows that sometimes the past refuses to rest, and its ghosts demand that we listen. Our chilling tale concludes here. Ready for the next ghostly whisper? I never intended to share what happened that night, but sometimes the truth finds a way to claw its way out of silence. I still remember every minute, every shudder, every heart-stopping second of that horrifying night shift. I'm sitting here recounting it, voice trembling and hands shaking, as if saying it out loud will make it less real. But I know it's real, etched permanently into my mind. It was a chilly autumn evening when I started my shift at the old hospital. I was a relatively new night nurse, eager to prove myself, despite the reputation of the facility for inexplicable happenings. I had heard whispers among the staff, rumors of eerie figures wandering the corridors, and unexplained sounds in rooms that had been long deserted. I brushed them off as superstitions until that night. As I stepped into the dimly lit hallways, the metallic clank of my shoes echoed off the sterile walls. The air was heavy, charged with something I couldn't quite place. I sensed I was not alone. I whispered to myself, "It's just the old building settling again," trying to convince my racing heart that nothing was truly amiss. I was making my routine rounds when I heard a soft sound, a gentle, rhythmic tapping coming from one of the patient rooms. The door, slightly ajar, revealed nothing but shadows and an emptiness that felt unnervingly profound. I hesitated, then approached, my flashlight trembling in my grasp. "Hello," I called, voice barely above a whisper. No answer, only a deeper silence that seemed to swallow my words. Minutes felt like hours as I stood there. My rational mind demanded a logical explanation, a loose shutter, a rodent, perhaps even the wind. But the cold dread that had coiled around my spine wouldn't release me. I left the room with a hasty apology to myself and continued my rounds. I reached the intensive care unit, a place where every heartbeat was a battle. There, I encountered Nurse Daniels, a seasoned nurse known for her frank descriptions of the unexplained. Her eyes were wide, as if she'd seen something she couldn't unsee. "You felt it too, didn't you?" she murmured. I nodded mutely, recalling the phantom tapping. Later that night, in a rarely used elevator near the basement, the atmosphere changed. I had pressed the button for floor -1 to collect some forgotten supplies. As the doors closed, the confined space filled with a heavy, oppressive energy. Halfway between floors, the elevator jolted violently. The digital display flickered erratically, settling on a floor that wasn't programmed on the panel, a floor labeled 0. My pulse hammered as I tried desperately to press the emergency button. Nothing happened. The elevator began to descend slowly on its own, the numbers counting down backwards. With every shift in the hum of the cables, I felt invisible eyes upon me, an inexplicable chill that seeped into my bones. I closed my eyes tightly, willing the descent to end, until finally the doors opened onto a floor that wasn't on any of the hospital maps. A bleak, undecorated corridor lit by a weak, flickering bulb. I stepped out, heart in my throat, and found myself in a space that reeked of abandonment. The walls were lined with outdated medical equipment, dusty and cobwebbed, as if the place hadn't been touched in decades. The corridor stretched on, winding into darkness, and as I walked, a distant sound, like the soft murmur of voices, grew louder. I couldn't decipher any words, only the persistent, sorrowful murmur of what seemed like regret or longing. I turned a corner and stopped dead in my tracks. Standing in the center of the room was a figure, shrouded in a tattered hospital gown. The figure's face was obscured by shadow, but there was something unsettlingly familiar about its posture. I felt compelled to speak, even though terror pinned me to the spot. "Who are you?" I managed to croak, voice quivering. The figure didn't respond immediately. Then, slowly, in a voice that resonated with a spectral sorrow, it replied, "I am the lost." The words dissolved into a whisper as the figure began to fade away before my eyes, leaving behind a cold gust that extinguished the weak bulb overhead. In that moment, every rational thought disintegrated into raw, unadulterated fear. My mind raced. Was I hallucinating? Stunned, I stumbled back through the labyrinth of corridors, the echo of my footsteps mingling with what sounded like desperate whispers chasing me. I tried retracing my steps to the elevator, but the corridor seemed to stretch, twist, and shift. Shadows danced mockingly on the walls, and I felt as though the building itself was alive, guiding me deeper into its heart of darkness. I eventually found the elevator and hit the button frantically. The door creaked open as a dim light spilled in, and I rushed inside, slamming the close button behind me. The ride back to the main floor was excruciatingly silent. The only noise was the frantic beating of my heart echoing in my ears. When the doors opened on a familiar floor, I leapt out, gasping for relief as the oppressive presence lifted slightly. It wasn't until I reached the nurse's station that I caught my breath and could begin to process what had happened. Colleagues listened with morbid curiosity as I recounted every detail, nodding with their own experiences that mirrored mine. They spoke in hushed tones about unexplained occurrences, about apparitions that wandered the hospital long after the patients had left, and about a lingering sorrow that permeated the building. I realized that I was not alone in my terror. That night changed me. I couldn't shake the feeling that the past was not as distant as one might think, and that some nights, the remnants of lost souls walk among us. I started keeping a record, a journal of every unusual occurrence during my shifts. Every creak in the silence, every unexplained sound became a piece of a larger, disturbing puzzle. Even now, I'm haunted by that night. At the quietest moments, when I'm alone with my thoughts, I can hear the soft tapping, see the faint shimmer of a light where no light should be, and feel the weight of a spirit's sorrow pressing against my chest. I tell myself it was a trick of the mind, an anomaly born from isolation and exhaustion, but deep down I know the truth. Every time I approach the hospital, I pause at the entrance, summoning the courage to step inside and face whatever waits in the shadows. I'm no longer the eager nurse who once believed only in science and logic. Now I've seen things that defy explanation, things that challenge every belief I ever held. I share my story with you not for pity, but to warn anyone who finds themselves on a night shift in places steeped in history and mystery. Remember that sometimes the darkest corridors of a building are not merely physical spaces, but portals to memories and spirits trapped in time. And if you ever feel that cold gaze upon your back or hear a desperate whisper in a long-forgotten hall, know that you are not alone. The past is always watching, waiting for someone to remember it. Our chilling tale concludes here. Ready for the next ghostly whisper? I still can't shake the memory of that fateful night, a night that changed everything. I'm sitting in my small apartment, still haunted by what I experienced during my first week as the night shift watchman at the old Brennan Lighthouse, a relic perched on a storm-battered cliffside that had been abandoned for decades. Before I detail every chilling moment, know that I share this account not for shock or attention, but to warn anyone who dares to work among echoes and shadows. I have been hired to maintain the building and keep vigil over the structure. The lighthouse, once a beacon for sailors in peril, had long lost its purpose, yet the locals swore it was still occupied by something other than memories. My first night felt no different from any other night shift. A few creaking floorboards and the constant gust of wind outside, rattling the weather-beaten windows, were all I expected. But as midnight approached, the atmosphere shifted. I commenced my rounds methodically, climbing the narrow, spiral staircase towards the lantern room at the top, checking each corridor and room for signs of intrusion or decay. Around 1 a.m., while I was inspecting the keeper's quarters, I heard a distinct sound, a faint tapping coming from behind a weathered metal door. With the dim beam of my flashlight trembling in my grip, I hesitated at the threshold before slowly pushing it open. Beyond the door lay an empty dressing room, its mirrors cracked and furnishings draped in white sheets. Yet the tapping persisted, as if coming from within the walls themselves. "Hello," I called out, my voice echoing in the hollow space. The silence that followed was deafening. I stepped inside, drawn to an old, tarnished mirror propped in the corner. And then I saw it, a subtle ripple in the reflection. For a fraction of a second, a figure in a faded uniform, complete with a weathered cap and a face etched with sorrow, stared back at me. I blinked rapidly, and the image vanished. My heart pounded as I stumbled back, questioning whether exhaustion had conjured this apparition or if something was truly lingering in the dark. Shaking off the incident, I continued my duties. It wasn't until I reached the lantern room that the real terror began. Standing beneath the massive light assembly, I felt an inexplicable pressure as if invisible hands were prying at my mind. The great glass window of the lantern room overlooked a turbulent sea, and as I scanned the horizon, I noticed a spectral glow in the distance, not from a moon, but an eerie, phosphorescent haze drifting close to the crashing waves. A voice, or perhaps just the wind, whispered my name. I froze, adrenaline surging, as the air thickened with an unsettling chill. "Who's there?" I demanded, though no human voice answered. The lamp flickered, casting sporadic shadows across the room. I couldn't shake the feeling of being observed by eyes that bore witness to centuries of despair. My unease grew when I received a late-night visitor at the entrance of the lighthouse, a local historian named Marie. She'd been tracking the folklore of the lighthouse for years, and despite her own grave superstitions, she agreed to share her notes with me that night. "There's something about this place," she confided in a trembling tone. "They say the previous keeper never left. His regrets and despair are bound to every stone here." Marie's words chilled me further, echoing the inexplicable sensations I'd just endured. I decided to record her stories later, but first I needed to secure the lighthouse as my shift continued. Venturing into the vast storage room near the base, I discovered a dusty ledger that belonged to the original keeper, a meticulous record of storms, shipwrecks, and, disturbingly, personal entries steeped in sorrow. The final entry read, "I cannot escape my fate. The sea has claimed my soul, and in this lonely tower I shall remain." The chilling simplicity of that sentence sent shivers down my spine, making me question if the keeper's despair had somehow seeped into the very walls of the building. Hours later, as the clock crept past 3 a.m., I embarked on one last round through the winding corridors. The silence was absolute, and the only sound was the relentless lashing of the wind against the stone facade. It was then that I came upon a door I hadn't noticed before, a door tucked away in a forgotten corner of the building, its surface scarred with age and neglect. Compelled by a mixture of dread and curiosity, I hesitated only for a moment before pushing it open. I stepped into what appeared to be a small chapel, an incongruous sanctuary within a lighthouse. The room was dimly lit by a solitary candle, its flame quivering as if disturbed by an unseen force. Against one wall hung a portrait of a man with sorrowful eyes, unmistakably the same spectral figure I'd seen earlier in the dressing room. My breath caught in my throat as I approached the painting, feeling an overwhelming familiarity and an inexplicable connection to the man's anguish. Then the door slammed behind me. I spun around, heart hammering, to find the exit blocked by a dense, unyielding darkness. Behind the portrait, a murmur began to build, a sorrowful sound that seemed to plead for recognition and release. "I've been waiting," the whisper said softly, echoing the lament of long-forgotten regrets. I couldn't move, paralyzed by fear and the weight of centuries of sorrow. In a burst of desperate courage, I yelled, "Who are you? What do you want from me?" The silence that followed was profound and oppressive until the candle flickered violently, and plunged the room into near darkness. When light returned, the portrait had changed. The man's face was now contorted in anguish, his eyes brimming with untold grief. The whisper came again, closer now. "Help me. Set me free." I realized then that I was not merely a caretaker of an old building, but an unwilling participant in an age-old tragedy. My rational mind screamed that I was caught in a nightmare. Yet my trembling body obeyed the unspoken command to ease the sorrow that clutched at the air. Clutching the ledger tightly, I mustered the resolve to speak with the spirit, confessing that I understood his plight and that his story would not be forgotten. I repeated softly, "I will remember you. I will tell your story so that your pain does not vanish into the void." The oppressive atmosphere seemed to ease momentarily, and for a brief second, I sensed the gentle warmth of gratitude in the spectral glow that surrounded me. Before I could grasp more of this uncanny connection, the door creaked open again and Marie reappeared. She'd sensed my distress through the old halls of the lighthouse. "I think he's telling you his final words," she whispered urgently. Together, we gathered what little light we could muster and gathered every scrap of evidence. Old letters, diary entries, relics of the past, to piece together the history of the forlorn keeper. It became clear that his isolation and despair had trapped him between worlds, yearning for someone to acknowledge his existence. The night waned, and with the first hints of dawn bleaching the horizon, the unnatural presence began to recede. The chapel door slowly swung open, offering an escape from the confines of that haunted space. Marie and I stepped into the corridor, both of us scarred by the knowledge of what lurked in the dark corners of history. The lighthouse had revealed its hidden grief, and in doing so, had forever altered our lives. I left that shift with a heavy heart and a promise to never forget the keeper's sorrow. Each night since, as I passed by the quiet, empty corridors and listened to the faint, mournful echoes, I remind myself that sometimes the most terrifying ghosts are not vengeful spirits, but the lost souls burdened by unresolved regret. And I, an unintentional witness to their eternal lament, continue to carry their memory with me. Our chilling tale concludes here. Ready for the next ghostly whisper? I still remember that night, as if it were seared into my memory, a night shift that unraveled every comforting illusion I once had about the world. I was working as the lone security officer at the Grand Clydesdale Inn, a once Grand Victorian orphanage transformed decades ago into an upscale hotel. The building carried an air of faded elegance and concealed secrets, but nothing could have prepared me for the terror that awaited me on that fateful evening. My shift began at 10 p.m. as I set out on my routine inspection of the corridors and common areas. The halls were silent except for the soft patter of rain against the tall, leaded windows and the occasional creaks of the ancient floorboards. I couldn't shake the feeling of being observed, the sensation of countless eyes tracing my every step. I dismissed it at first as mere nerves, the consequence of working alone in a building with as much history as this one. Around midnight, while passing by what used to be the dining hall, now converted into an opulent lounge, I noticed a faint flickering of lights in one of the long-abandoned wings. Curiosity pried at me despite my escalating apprehension. I followed the trembling light down a hallway lined with portraits of somber, lost children whose eyes seemed to follow my progress. There, in the dusty glow from a broken chandelier, lay a door that I'd never seen before. The plaque on it read, "Rosemary's Quarters," a room now sealed off and untouched, yet inexplicably warm compared to the freezing corridor. Hesitation battled with duty inside me as I approached the door. My hand trembled as I reached for the handle. A quiet whisper echoed in the hallway, a soft, sibilant murmur that sounded almost like a name being called. Marina. It was barely audible, yet it jolted my senses. With a deep, unsteady breath, I pushed the door open. Inside, the room was a time capsule of another era. Faded wallpaper, a once beautiful vanity, and a plush armchair with frayed cushions told tales of days gone by. But what struck me most was a small, silver music box resting atop a dresser. Compelled as if by an unseen force, I reached out and opened it. The delicate tinkling melody that began to play was both soothing and sorrowful. As the tune filled the room, the atmosphere shifted. Shadows gathered unnaturally at the edge of my vision, coalescing into a shape. A small girl, perhaps no older than 10, standing by the window. Her eyes were hollow, and her expression one of deep longing. I froze, caught between a frantic urge to flee and a need to understand. "Who are you?" I managed to stutter, my voice a mix of fear and compassion. The apparition's lips moved silently, and though I couldn't discern her words, the air around me thickened with a palpable grief. Slowly, she turned towards me. I could feel the chill of her presence clawing at the warmth of the room. The music box's melody warped, becoming distorted as if echoing a lament from another time. I stumbled back, heart racing, and shut the door hurriedly behind me, the ghost's forlorn gaze haunting my every thought. I retreated to the security office, a small, cramped room filled with monitors and blinking control panels. My hands shook as I logged the incident, but my rational mind struggled to make sense of what I had seen. Had my fatigue and isolation conjured this vision, or was it something truly beyond comprehension? Determined to uncover some answers, I began scanning old records of the building on my computer. Late into the night, I discovered a faded newspaper clipping tucked away in the digital archives. It recounted the tragic story of a little girl named Marina Rosemary, once a resident of the orphanage. Abandoned at a young age, Marina had perished under mysterious circumstances, a death shrouded in sorrow and a lingering curse that plagued the building for decades. It was said that her spirit had never found peace, forever trapped between the worlds of the living and the dead, calling out for acknowledgement. As the clock in the office ticked towards 2 a.m., the silence outside deepened into an oppressive void. The monitors began to flicker, and static interference filled the screens. I tried to refocus, but a sudden scraping sound coming from the corridor outside made my blood run cold. It was a slow, deliberate sound like fingernails dragging across wood. I hesitated only a moment before grabbing my flashlight and stepping out to investigate. The corridor was shrouded in shadow, the only illumination coming from my wavering beam. I followed the sound until it led me to a narrow staircase spiraling downward into the basement. Each step creaked ominously under my weight, and the sound grew louder with every descent, until it finally stopped at a heavy, reinforced door-marked storage. I pushed the door open, its hinges groaning in protest. Inside, the room was cramped and suffocating, filled with forgotten relics of the building's past. In one corner, piled between dusty boxes, lay a worn teddy bear with one button eye missing. I couldn't help but think it resembled something from a childhood memory, yet I had no such recollection. A sudden cold draft swept the room, carrying with it a voice, a fragmented chorus of words that seemed both desperate and pleading. "Help me, please." The voice reverberated off the walls, a spectral cry lost in time. Overwhelmed by a mix of pity and terror, I knelt before a box marked with Marina's name. Inside, I found a collection of faded drawings and photographs. Images of a young girl smiling through tear-streaked faces, snapshots of happier days that belied the tragedy of her story. I felt an intense need to honor her memory, to offer her the solace she had been denied in life. "I'm sorry," I whispered softly into the darkness. "I never knew your pain." For a moment, the room was still. Then, as if in answer, the temperature dropped further and a faint outline of Marina materialized behind me. She was no longer that forlorn child at the window. Here she seemed more solid, her ghostly features etched with the wisdom of unfulfilled dreams. Her eyes, now brimming with a silent gratitude, held mine. In that silent communion, I sensed that our encounter was not one of malice, but of a deep, profound sorrow, and perhaps a plea for release. With trembling resolve, I gathered the documents and mementos into a bag. I knew then what I must do. The following morning, with the reluctant assistance of the inn's manager, I arranged for a proper memorial to be held in Marina's honor. Local historians and descendants of the orphanage's former caretakers came together in a small chapel within the hotel. We read her story aloud, shared her drawings, and placed a small memorial plaque in the quiet corner of the once-forgotten wing. As the ceremony concluded, a soft breeze whispered through the room, and for a fleeting moment, I could have sworn I saw Marina's ghost smile one final time before fading away. That night's shift, a night saturated with terror, sorrow, and unexpected compassion, changed me irrevocably. I had witnessed a ghost not born of malice, but of a desperate need for remembrance and love. I continue to work at the Grand Clydesdale Inn, now with a new sense of duty, to honor the stories of those who have been lost and to ensure that their voices are never silenced again. Every creak, every shadow, every whisper in the dark reminds me of Marina's enduring presence, and I find solace in the belief that perhaps her spirit, and those like her, have finally found a measure of peace. Our chilling tale concludes here. Ready for the next ghostly whisper? I never imagined that a solitary night at the Bell Tower Lighthouse would alter the course of my life so indelibly. I had taken the job as the night shift keeper, a position that promised quiet reflection and the steady rhythm of the ocean. The lighthouse stood on a jagged cliff overlooking a tempestuous sea, its beams slicing through the darkness like a vigilant eye. Locals whispered about its tragic past, of a keeper who had lost everything and a daughter whose untimely death had left an eternal mark on the stone walls. I dismissed these tales as folklore until that fateful night proved otherwise. My first evening began uneventfully enough. I arrived just before dusk, greeted by a sky streaked with the colors of a fading sunset. The weathered structure loomed silently as I climbed the spiraling staircase to the lantern room. Its narrow, winding steps creaked underfoot, and each step felt like a descent further into a realm of solitude. The interior was sparse. Old logs lined the walls, and a well-worn desk sat near a dusty window that framed the stormy sea below. I set up my small station, determined to keep the light burning as a beacon for passing ships and, as I later realized, for wandering souls. The night deepened, and with it came a profound hush that blanketed the lighthouse. At first, the silence was comforting, a gentle reminder of the isolation that allowed for uninterrupted thought. But as midnight neared, an unsettling chill began to permeate the air. It was not merely the crisp ocean breeze that seeped through the ancient stones. It was an inexplicable coldness that seemed to emanate from the very walls of the building. I shrugged it off as a quirk of the old structure, but an uneasy feeling tugged at my mind. Around 1 a.m., while methodically inspecting the lantern mechanism, I heard a soft murmur that sounded almost like a lullaby drifting over the wind. The sound was faint, barely audible above the hum of the machinery, yet carried an air of melancholy that pierced the silence. I followed the sound to a narrow corridor leading to a forgotten storage room. The door, heavy and ornate with faded carvings, swung open with a creak that echoed ominously. Inside, the dim light of my flashlight revealed boxes and old personal effects, remnants of a time long past. But in one dusty corner, I saw something that made my blood run cold. A small, delicate doll dressed in antiquated clothing, its porcelain face cracked and eyes glistening as if filled with unshed tears. I reached out with trembling fingers, but before I could touch it, a whisper echoed softly behind me. "Help me." The voice was fragile and tinged with despair, and I spun around, heart pounding, yet the corridor remained empty. Determined to understand the source of the voice, I returned to the lantern room and began poring over the few records that had been left behind by previous keepers. I discovered entries detailing a great storm decades ago. A night when the keeper, Edmund Bellamy, lost his daughter, Lillian, to the raging sea. The journal recounted how Lillian had been the light of his life, her laughter once filling these very halls. But the night of her disappearance, a violent tempest had swept her away, and with it, a piece of his soul. The journal ended abruptly, leaving behind only a lingering sorrow that seemed to whisper from every page. It was then that I realized the voice in the corridor might have been Lillian's, reaching out from beyond the veil. As the hours dragged on, the lighthouse took on an increasingly surreal quality. The beam from the lantern seemed to waver, as though influenced by an unseen hand. I began to notice fleeting reflections in the glass of the large, weathered mirror that hung above the desk. A young girl, her eyes wide with silent terror, appearing behind me and vanishing in an instant. I felt as though I were being observed by a presence that was both tender and tragic. Each creak of the floorboards and every gust of wind became an omen, hinting at the past that refused to die. A particularly intense encounter occurred shortly after 3 a.m. While checking the external gallery, a narrow ledge along the cliffside from which the light was projected, I heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps behind me. I paused, scanning the darkness with my flashlight. The beam caught a glimpse of a figure in a flowing dress, standing at the very edge of the gallery. The figure was illuminated by the moonlight, ethereal and otherworldly. As I moved closer, my heart thudded in disbelief. It was a young woman, her eyes sorrowful and pleading. I approached cautiously, but as I neared, she faded into the shadows like a wisp of fog. In her place, I was left with the lingering echo of her silent plea. Shaken to my core, I retreated inside and double-checked every lock and window, ensuring the safety of the lighthouse. The night had taken on a new dimension, a realm where the boundaries between the living and the dead blurred, and where every shadow held memories of untold grief. I could no longer deny that I was not alone. The presence of Lillian, or perhaps the combined sorrow of Edmund and his lost daughter, seemed to haunt every corner of the old building. Unable to sleep, I found myself drawn to the journal again. I read late into the night, absorbing every detail of the tragedies that had unfolded here. It was as if the pages themselves were imbued with a spirit, whispering secrets of longing and despair. With each passing hour, I began to feel an inexplicable kinship with the tortured souls of the lighthouse. Their anguish resonated with my own hidden fears, and I found solace in the thought that perhaps, by bearing witness to their story, I might help release them from their eternal torment. As dawn approached, the spectral manifestations began to recede, and the familiar rhythms of the night shift gave way to a tentative calm. I performed my final checks, leaving the lantern to burn steadily as the first light of day crept over the horizon. Yet, even as the darkness yielded to dawn, I could still feel the ghostly presence lingering in the corners of my vision. The soft murmur of a lullaby, the brush of an unseen hand on my shoulder, the sorrowful eyes of a little girl who had been lost to the sea. In the weeks that followed, I often recalled that night with a mix of dread and compassion. I left the lighthouse shortly thereafter, unable to reconcile the living world with the realm of the departed. But the memories remain, etched into my soul like the scars of a long-forgotten tragedy. I share my experience as both a warning and a remembrance. Some places carry echoes of grief so profound that they never truly fade away. Even in our modern lives, where logic and reason govern, there exists a space where the past reaches out with desperate hands, pleading for acknowledgement and release. Our chilling tale concludes here. Ready for the next ghostly whisper? It was on a moonless night that I first set foot in the depths of the abandoned manufacturing plant, a place where the echoes of machinery past still whispered in the dark. I had taken the night security job as a way to make ends meet, thinking the isolated shift in this dilapidated facility would be uneventful. Little did I know, the very walls of that forsaken building harbored secrets that would upend everything I knew about life and death. The plant, once a booming center for industrial innovation, now sat in eerie silence, its vast halls dark and brittle with neglect. My shift began like any other, patrolling endless corridors with only the harsh beam of my flashlight for company. The rhythmic hum of broken generators and the sound of my own footsteps were my sole companions. However, as I moved deeper into the maze of rusted pipes and crumbling scaffolding, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. My first unsettling encounter happened as I crossed the main assembly line, a cavernous area littered with remnants of long-forgotten machines. In the far corner of the room, where the gloom seemed to thicken, I glimpsed what looked like the fleeting outline of a figure. I stopped dead in my tracks, heart pounding, and scanned the area. There was nothing there but the shadow of the decayed machinery and a thin veil of dust stirred by my movement. Yet the sensation persisted, as though invisible eyes tracked my every step. Determined not to let fear overcome me, I retraced my path toward the security office for a brief respite. I had hoped that a few moments of solitude in a confined space would calm the rising panic. However, as I reached the door, an inexplicable chill sent shivers down my spine. Pausing before the locked office door, I noticed a faint pattern etched into the metal, a series of numbers and symbols that seemed to pulse under my touch. I couldn't decipher any meaning from them, but a sudden whisper, almost inaudible, echoed in the recesses of my mind. Remember us, confused and unnerved. I stepped away, quickly deciding that dwelling on such details would only fuel my imagination. The night's unrelenting stillness was shattered soon after by the sound of metallic clanking coming from a lower level of the building. Reluctantly, I followed the noise to a narrow set of stairs spiraling downward. As I descended, the temperature dropped markedly. My breath became visible, a soft mist that mingled with the dust motes dancing in the beam of my flashlight. At the bottom, I found myself in what appeared to be an old storage chamber, a forgotten space lined with crates and relics of machinery that once powered the plant. Here, the air was thick, oppressive, as if the room itself was heavy with unsaid sorrow. It was in that cramped, desolate space that I encountered her, a young woman, barely more than a whisper of a figure, standing near a crate stacked with tarnished tools. Her clothes were tattered, and her eyes, though faint, brimmed with melancholy. She seemed not to notice my intrusion into her lonely vigil. "Who are you?" I asked, my voice surprisingly steady despite the pounding of my heart. But her expression offered no comfort. Instead, her gaze fixed on something beyond my reach, as if searching for a memory lost in time. Before I could speak again, she melted into a haze of mist, leaving behind a lingering scent of damp earth and forgotten grief. Trembling, I hurried back up the stairs, the encounter replaying over and over in my mind. I tried to convince myself it was merely a trick of the light, a figment of a tired imagination compounded by the oppressive gloom of the plant. Yet, each step back to the upper levels only deepened my disquiet, as if the building itself was alive, aware of my fear, and intent on drawing me further into its haunted past. When I returned to the main hall, I discovered something that made my blood run cold. In the center of the vast space, a set of rusted tools lay arranged in a perfect circle. There was something almost ritualistic about their placement, too precise, too deliberate to have been scattered by chance. As I knelt to inspect them, I noticed inscriptions on the floor in a language I couldn't decipher. The markings pulsed with a dim, sickly glow, and as I traced them with a trembling finger, a rush of fragmented images invaded my mind. Faces contorted in anguish, hands reaching out in desperation, and a chorus of silent screams echoing in an endless void. Determined to escape the unsettling visions, I made for the exit, only to discover that the corridor I'd taken earlier had transformed. The familiar path had given way to a twisting labyrinth of hallways, each more disorienting than the last. My flashlight flickered in and out, leaving me in pockets of total darkness where every sound was amplified. The whisper of my breath, the dragging of unseen footsteps, and the low, mournful hum of a tune that seemed to seep from the very floor. Then came the low, grating voice, a sound so laden with despair that it made my skin crawl. The voice recited fragmented lines as if part of an ancient lament. We are the forsaken, bound by time. It was not a single voice, but a chorus of sorrow, resonating from the walls themselves. I felt the pull of that lament as it seeped into my bones, dragging memories and lost dreams into the foreground. Fear and pity warred within me, and for a moment, I felt compelled to understand the sorrow that had long haunted this forsaken place. I pressed on, driven by equal parts dread and an inexplicable desire to see these spirits find their rest. In one narrow corridor that led to an observation deck overlooking the vast plant floor, I found an old porcelain doll lying face down on a dusty bench. The doll's eyes, too lifelike for comfort, were fixed on a far-off point as if witness to horrors unseen. I picked it up gently, and in that instant, an overwhelming vision struck me. The doll had once been a cherished possession of a little girl whose life was abruptly cut short in a tragic accident at the plant decades ago. The vision was fleeting, a glimpse of laughter turned to tears of a family shattered by loss. I could almost feel her sorrow pressing against the glass of time, a desperate plea for acknowledgement from beyond the veil. The clock of the building chimed in the distance, jolting me back to the present. It was nearly the break of dawn, but my spirit was heavy with the night's spectral burdens. As I gathered my thoughts and navigated the familiar exit path once more, I noticed one final, startling detail. The images and inscriptions that had plagued me throughout the night were slowly beginning to recede, as if the building itself was exhaling after a long-held breath. The hallways grew less menacing, the shadows less oppressive, and the murmurs faded into the background. A gentle reminder that the night's dark secrets were bound to the darkness and would retreat with the coming of light. Stepping outside, I paused to look back at the imposing silhouette of the manufacturing plant. In that moment, I felt a mix of relief and lingering sorrow, a profound empathy for the lost souls entangled in the building's tragic past. The experience had changed me irrevocably, planting a deep understanding that some places remain haunted by time itself, where every creak and whisper is a tether to memories that cannot fade. Even now, as I recount these events, the chilling details persist with unnerving clarity. I share this story to remind others that the night holds mysteries beyond our comprehension, and some shifts come with a cost that lingers long after the break of dawn. Our chilling tale concludes here. Ready for the next ghostly whisper?